We begin the day with a plea for a return to a past plan for peace, the two-state solution. That vision of a Palestinian state existing alongside Israel was last on the negotiating table at U.S.-sponsored talks in 2014. Now, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is visiting Israel and the Palestinian territories at a time when the region is suffering some of the bloodiest violence in years. After Blinken met Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the two men emphasized the central concern of security.
I have to tell you that I also believe that expanding the circle of peace, working to close, finally, the file of the Arab-Israeli conflict, I think would also help us achieve a workable solution with our Palestinian neighbors.
As we advance Israel's integration, we can do so in ways that improve the daily lives of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And that's crucial to moving toward our enduring goal of Palestinians and Israelis enjoying equal measures of freedom, security, opportunity, justice, and dignity.
More now with Nathan Sachs. He's the director at the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. Mr. Sachs, good to see you. Blinken's central message there has been one of condemnation and de-escalation. What can the U.S. do to keep this situation, this very dangerous situation, from spiraling out of control?
Well, the U.S. levers are limited, but of course it's one of the key players in trying to stave off what really is a very dangerous situation. The United States is trying to press upon the Israeli government to rein in all elements that would trigger fire in what already is a very heavily fueled arena. And on the Palestinian side, we see a very worrying decay in the Palestinian Authority's ability to control the situation, especially in the northern West Bank. So the United States, on the one hand, is pressing the leaders to try to urge calm, to try to rein in some of the more radical elements, for example, of Netanyahu's coalition. And on the other hand, finds itself also with the possibility of a cat and mouse kind of game, following every activity on the ground, trying to coordinate among the troops there, something the United States has not had to do in a long time.
Before this latest spate of violence, Blinken said he'd traveled to the Middle East in the capacity of a mediator. Is there any ground for mediation at this point?
Well, it depends what you call mediation. The United States has a very important role to play in trying to calm things down and avoid the worst, because the worst could be very bad. But the prospects of actual mediation in terms of a peace negotiation, returning to negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians on a two-state solution, that at the moment is simply not in the cards. And I don't think anyone in Washington, including Secretary Blinken, have any illusions about the possibility. We hear the Americans talk about the two-state solution. It's become a bit of a pablum by now, people speaking about this as the ultimate goal, as it should be, I think. But the prospect of any meaningful negotiation between this government in Israel and this leadership on the Palestinians, that prospect is very slim.
How concerned is the U.S. about Israel's new hardline government, especially in the pursuit of a solution to the conflict?
Well, the administration finds itself in a real bind. They're very concerned, on the one hand. Netanyahu has really some of the most radical members of a coalition that he's ever had. He is, in fact, the most left-wing, most moderate member of his coalition to many degrees. And he himself, of course, is a known quantity. He's not someone that the administration loves, but he is someone they know how to work with, and he's certainly a cautious leader. Together with him, however, are very extreme members, especially the minister in charge of the police and the finance minister. And the minister in charge of the police, for example, just a couple of years ago in May 2021, was one of the provocateurs on the streets that helped foment the violence. Not him alone, but him as well. Now he's in charge of police. So the administration really has a very difficult task dealing with this new Israeli government. It also faces an Israeli government that is trying to dramatically alter the relations between the judiciary and the executive and the parliament in Israel in a way, in a path that would lead Israel in a Hungarian or Polish model, a very troubling prospect for many in Israel who hope for democracy to continue. The administration, of course, is wary of diving into domestic issues like that, but there too we see real concern. All that said, America and this administration is busy with other things, of course, and this is not the highest priority.
Yeah. What would the U.S. like to see at this point as far as bilateral peace efforts could go?
At the moment, the aims are very modest, and that is to try and calm things down to avoid the worst in the short term. And secondly, to leave open the door for the possibility of a two-state solution down the road, possibility of returning to negotiations if there are some political changes on both sides. And both of those tasks are very difficult. Avoiding the worst in the short term will require luck and a lot of coordination and effort, not just by the Americans, but by others as well. And trying to stave off a closing of the door for a two-state solution will be hard as well. The finance minister, whom I mentioned before, Bezalel Smotrich, is hell-bent on trying to avoid that and promote de facto annexation of the West Bank. That is something the administration is also paying a lot of attention to, but it's, again, the cards it has in its hand are limited.
Blinken has been an outspoken critic of Israel's settlement policy. How much leverage does he have with Netanyahu when it comes to his government's plans that he announced in response to the recent attacks to actually expand the settlements?
Well, the U.S. has a lot of leverage with Israel. Of course, it's a very close ally of Israel. It's Israel's most important supporter by far in the world, and the Israelis know that very well. So to the degree that the administration in Washington is willing to expend political and diplomatic effort on this, they can move quite a bit in Israel. Their pressure would mostly be on Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he would like to avoid any major crisis. But of course, he's not the only one there. He already has coalition partners who are not interested in stopping settlement activity, quite the reverse. And so there's a real domestic struggle that the United States finds itself in, not for the first time, I should say. It's a very recurrent theme in U.S.-Israeli relations. The Biden administration is very concerned about settlement activity, precisely for the possibility of closing the possibility of two-state solution in the future. But and they will be pressing Netanyahu for it. The problem is not so much in the grand announcements from Netanyahu, it's more on the bureaucratic moves below the political level that advance de facto annexation and may proceed even short of any grand new announcement from Netanyahu himself.
This meeting was, of course, overshadowed by the recent violence, but there were other important regional issues on the agenda, too. Iran, Saudi Arabia. What is, at this point, the U.S. top priority in the Middle East?
Well, it's interesting. The United States, after decades of having the Middle East so central, really is concerned with other areas first, of course, with China and obviously Russia and Ukraine, closer to home where you are. But in the Middle East, there are still very high concerns, and top among them is Iran. Iran's nuclear program is proceeding. The return to the JCPOA, to mutual compliance with the JCPOA, seems to be farther away than ever. We've heard the president say off the cuff that it's probably dead at this stage. Maybe it will be resurrected. And so the possibility of Iran approaching nuclear capacity is very serious. Just last week, we saw a huge joint military operation between the United States and Israel, and unprecedented, the largest ever in history. And that was meant to send a signal to many parties, but especially to Tehran, that at the end of the day, if they truly approach nuclear capability, they might find a joint U.S.-Israeli front. And we also heard news now of mysterious bombings in Iran aimed at especially facilities for missiles. That's been attributed to the Israelis by others. This is an ongoing campaign. There's been very little quiet in it in the last few years. What's changed now is the possibility of a joint Israeli-American position, at least hinting that as last resort, perhaps there's real threat of force even by the United States.
Nathan Sachs of the Brookings Institution, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.